It started like any other film release: an ambitious director, a celebrated actor, a compelling story. But The Goat Life did more than entertain. It ignited a firestorm in the heart of the Gulf. The nearly 3-hour film, streaming on Netflix, portrays the harrowing journey of a Malayali Indian migrant worker who was coerced into working without pay as a goat herder in the Saudi Arabian desert. It's a story based on a true account, and it did something unprecedented. It shook the foundations of one of the most controversial labor systems in the world, the Saudi Kafala system. The story begins with a young man from Kerala, India, a simple migrant worker with dreams of a better life. His journey to Saudi Arabia, however, quickly turns into a nightmare. Forced into the desolate expanse of the desert, he becomes an isolated goat herder, living without pay, without contact, and eventually without his sanity. This stark portrayal of migrant life under the kafala system, often compared to modern-day slavery, didn't sit well with many in Saudi Arabia. Upon its release, the film, based on the best-selling novel Goat Days by Benjamin, sparked an immediate backlash. Saudi audiences accused the filmmakers and Netflix of misrepresenting their country and damaging its image. Social media buzzed with accusations, calling the film a conspiracy against Saudi Arabia and a calculated attack on the land of the two holy mosques. Allegations even extended to Algeria and Jordan, where parts of the film were shot, claiming these nations had colluded with India to malign the kingdom's reputation. Yet, amid the fury and calls for boycotts, another conversation began to surface, one that many in the Gulf had long tried to silence. The controversy swirling around the goat life exposed the persistent shadow of the kafala system, a labor sponsorship mechanism still in use across Gulf Cooperation Council countries, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Widely criticized by international human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, the kafala system has been labeled as abusive and akin to modern-day slavery. Under this system, migrant workers' legal status is tied to their employer, or kafil, granting employers overwhelming control over their employees' lives. This power imbalance has led to countless documented cases of exploitation, abuse, forced labor, and even human trafficking. In Saudi Arabia, migrant workers have faced physical abuse, withheld wages, confiscation of passports, and severe restrictions on their freedom of movement. The plight of these workers, however, rarely makes it to mainstream media, until now. The response from Saudi Arabia was swift and aggressive. Social media platforms like X were flooded with videos from Saudi sponsors, or kafils, featuring their foreign workers smiling and thanking their employers for their kindness in an attempt to prove that they are not all bad. Some Saudis even took to posting videos showcasing the so-called good treatment of their employees, an apparent attempt to counter the narrative depicted in the film. However, many observers were quick to point out the selective outrage. They are calling for the boycott of the movie not because of any inaccuracies, but because it dares to expose the realities of the kafala system in the Middle East that they would rather keep hidden, said one Reddit user, encapsulating a growing sentiment online. As the flames of controversy grew, so did the film's viewership. People from around the world, intrigued by the uproar, tuned in to watch the movie, unintentionally magnifying its reach and impact. The spotlight turned toward the very system that Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states seemed eager to protect. The kafala system, long criticized for its exploitative practices, became a topic of heated debate on international platforms. Saudi critics, however, did not focus on the actual suffering depicted in the movie, but instead on the filmmaker's supposed motives to smear Saudi Arabia's image. They accused the film of being a fabrication and a deliberate attempt to undermine the country's reputation. The backlash, however, largely ignored the broader and more critical issue: the real-life abuses faced by foreign workers across the region. To understand the depth of the controversy, one must look at the history of the kafala system itself. Introduced in the Gulf states in the 1950s, the system was originally intended to provide a legal framework for labor migration, necessary for rapid economic development. However, over the years, it evolved into a mechanism that gave employers near total control over their foreign workers. This control often extends to determining when or if a worker can leave the country, change jobs, or even go on vacation. Numerous tragic stories have emerged over the decades, from Indian workers in Saudi Arabia sleeping in the open desert with only goats for company, to Ethiopian workers held in detention centers under horrifying conditions. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the kafala system has proven itself to be a breeding ground for human rights violations. The release of The Goat Life seems to have acted as a catalyst for renewed scrutiny and criticism of the kafala system. International human rights organizations, activists, and even governments began calling for more transparency and reform. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International emphasized that the film's portrayal, far from being fictional, reflected documented abuses experienced by countless migrant workers under the kafala system. In response, Saudi Arabia's recent reforms, like the 2021 Initiative to Improve Workers' Contractual Relations, have been widely dismissed as inadequate. Despite official efforts to reform or even abolish the kafala system, significant parts of it remain in place, especially for domestic and low-skilled workers, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Art has the power to tell stories that others want to hide. Comments an Arab film critic, the controversy surrounding The Goat Life has inadvertently elevated the film from a simple work of cinema to a powerful statement against systemic abuse. It has become a symbol of resistance against a status quo that millions of migrant workers endure across the Gulf region. While the outrage from Saudi Arabia and its neighbors has certainly drawn attention, it has also exposed a new audience to the realities faced by migrant workers. As calls for boycotts grow louder, so too does the global conversation about the necessity of genuine reform, shining a light on a reality that many in power would prefer to keep hidden. In the end, The Goat Life may be just one film, but it has done what countless human rights reports and diplomatic efforts have struggled to achieve, highlighting the human cost of the kafala system in the eyes of the world. Whether or not this will lead to real change remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, a single story has sparked a conversation that is far from over.